Tonight it's going to be just a little bit different than the way I normally do these. Usually I do the talking and you sit there and passively receive what I say. So tonight you've been passed out some little sheets and you're going to play a part in this little presentation. And I'm going to ask you to do something too that's a little bit difficult, and that is to put away your southern biases. I know it's not going to be easy. I'm from Georgia. He went through my town in Georgia, and he's not fondly remembered by anyone there. But try and just put it away and just go by the material we present here tonight and decide if he is guilty or not guilty. Okay? One of the enduring questions, maybe we can get some lights off in here. You can see this a little bit better. Military historians have argued this for years about whether or not what Sherman did was a war crime or not. And in fact, it's one of the two questions that will appear almost in every history course to do with the Civil War. And was it a war crime? And the other alternative is, was Sherman a pioneer and the first person to conduct total warfare as we know total warfare today? And we're not going to try and answer the second question tonight. We'll just concentrate on the first one and see how it turns out. Some of these people that are pioneers in total warfare were General Curtis Lemay, whom I served under in the Air Force when he was a commander-in-chief of the Strategic Air Command. The others you may not have heard of. And I can never say this Italian name right. Giulio Douhet. Okay. An Italian, Billy Mitchell. Certainly we all know about Billy Mitchell. And Hugh Trenchard was a British air power person. As far back, and this is a lead article out of the June 1964 Civil War Times Illustrated magazine. So it shows you that this question goes back a long ways. And if you read some of Sherman's writings, he's probably aware that people were saying these things of him because he addresses some of these things in his post-war writings. So without any further more, we'll just go ahead and look into what we can do with Mr. Sherman. What I'm asking you to do tonight is to act as a kind of a grand jury. And you have a sheet there. This will be done kind of in the way that the military does court-martials. This is a mixture of a court-martial and a grand jury, in which there's a charge, which is what is the basic law, and then there's a specification, which are the details of how that person broke that law. And that's the format we'll follow. And after each one of these, I'll ask you to mark your sheets. And then when it's all over with, we'll pass them in and have the commander and the chaplain to tally up the results and see what the decision is. As always, there has to be a standard or law to which someone is accountable. We have it in our civil society. There are laws, the legislatures pass laws, and those are essentially a standard of our behavior. One being we don't go around murdering people. It's against the law. That's the standard. If there is no standard, then any behavior is acceptable. You go back to the times maybe of Genghis Khan, there were no standards. Anything he did was perfectly legitimate. There were no standards to hold him accountable to. But today we do have standards, and what we're going to look at and see is what standards were available in the Civil War. And as near as my research can turn up, there are 3 standards that applied in the age of the Civil War. And the first of these is the customary usage of long-standing. In other words, the customary laws of war, the way things have been done always. They're usually not written. The other was the Geneva Convention of 1864. The very first Geneva Convention was 1864. And then the third one is the Lieber Code, which is known as General Order 100. Some of you who've been studying the Civil War and reading things, you may come across this term, General Order 100. And we're going to go into that in a little bit tonight. So looking at the customary and usage laws of war, they're based on practices that go back sometimes hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, some of them go back all the way back into the Old Testament. They go back in the early times of Islam. They go back to the Roman Catholic Church after, in the Dark Ages, when the governments had fallen and there was no real governments around. The Catholic Church promulgated some of these rules of warfare. They have to meet two criteria. First, it's a practice by nations as a custom, and it has to be recognized as a custom. You do this and you expect the person to respond in a certain way. The other is that there's an agreement among nations that this is a practice. This sounds like a lot of fluff talk here, but we'll give you an example here. The use of a white flag. There are no treaties, there were no conventions, there nothing in writing that said, you know, a white flag means I want to come out and talk to your side. It's just one of those conventions of war that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. So the question we have now is, do the customary laws of warfare apply to Sherman? Well, actually, they do. They're applicable to him. And Sherman would have studied these when he was a cadet at West Point. Those things would have been drilled into him for the years he was there as a cadet. They were followed during the Mexican War, and so Sherman was well familiar with these rules of warfare. The second one of these is the Geneva Convention of 1864, and it's called the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded in Armies in the Field. This convention only consisted of 12 articles, 12 paragraphs, and they all pertain to how we're going to take care of wounded soldiers in the field. This really grew out of the Crimean War. I've not really studied the Crimean, but everything I've read about the Crimean, it was just about as horrible as the American Civil War in the way of injuries and things. It was signed by 10 European states on August the 22nd of 1864. And I would just point out, this date is a real important date here. And the 12 countries were 4 of them that now make up Germany, because Germany wasn't always the Germany that we know of. It was several other smaller countries that eventually got consolidated over time. Portugal, Italy, obviously Switzerland, and a few others. There are a couple notable absences on signing this convention, and that is the United States didn't sign it, nor did Britain, neither one of us. We signed it. Clara Barton had a major campaign in 1882 and finally essentially forced the United States into signing this thing. But it was a very limited treaty. It only pertained to how you're going to deal with wounded soldiers. So the question now is this applicable to Sherman? Okay, it's not applicable. Remember I said that date was critical, August the 22nd of 1864? He started his Georgia campaign in July of 1864, so he's already into this campaign before they even sit down at the table to sign it. It's also not applicable to him because the United States didn't sign it until 1882. He's not obligated to comply with a treaty that our country has not signed. So he's off the hook on this one. So that leads us down to General Order number 100, and this is known as the Lieber Code. And Lieber was an attorney, law professor, and was asked by the Lincoln administration to write up this code, and he did. And it consists of 156 articles. And the last time I did this, I had a copy I could pass around so you could look and see what some of those 156 articles were, but somebody kept it. So I don't have that here with me to show you. It was written by Professor Lieber, turned over to a panel of Union Army officers who reviewed these criteria and approved it and made some minor modifications. And then it went along to Abraham Lincoln for his signature. So this is signed by the highest authority. And remember, the Constitution of the United States, in Article 2, I think it says the President of the United States is authorized to supply the rules and regulations for the governance of the military. Okay, that's what he did here. In 1904, there was another Geneva Convention, and the Geneva Convention of 1904 is almost word for word what the Lieber Code is. When all these countries got together to come up with a code of warfare, they essentially adopted almost word for word the United States Code. It's a little hard to find. I've worked with this thing for years and didn't know where to find it. So if you're interested in how to locate a copy of it, there's the reference. And the key thing is it's in Series 3, Volume 3. And most of the time when we're doing research on the Civil War, we're working on Series 1. So it's in one of those other areas of the official records that we don't normally look at. I think Series 3 is General Administration of the Armies in the Civil War. Like any long code of laws, and that's what it is, it's the military laws, it has some internal conflicts. And just to give you a couple examples, because there are many of them in there, is Article 15 states that military necessity allows for the destruction of all property. So a commander, if he is following those orders, he can destroy any property he so chooses under the authority of that particular article. Yes?
If we had no guidelines to go by as far as trying generals or officers for war crimes, how could they bring up charges against the commander of Andersonville as being the only one that was...
Well, that's a little... I'd like to stay away from that for the moment if we could, because these are the ones that apply to the Union Army,
right.
Not... You're going to see when we get down to the very last slide up here where that will show, okay? We'll get it on that one, okay? Article 22, which says kind of the converse of this, the principle has been more and more acknowledged that the unarmed citizen is to be spared in person, property, and honor as much as the exigencies of war allow. And to make that a little bit smoother reading, you could say as much as the military necessity of war allows. Now that's a little bit different than the article up above it. I mean, the first one is absolute unlimited power to destroy property. The other one says you should really take some other considerations in. And then there's a catch-all in Article 5, which simply says, to save the country is paramount to all other considerations. So failing everything else, no matter what a federal commander does, he can always claim, I did it to save the Union. That's his escape route. So, once again, are these things applicable to Sherman? They certainly are. They're signed by Lincoln, his commander-in-chief, and so they do apply to him. Tonight we're going to look at two kinds of charges to bring against General Sherman, and the first of these are what I would call personal charges. These are things that he himself has his hands on. In other words, he's personally involved in these particular charges. The second, of course, is what we would call command responsibility, where he is he responsible for the actions of his troops. So there are two different ones, the ones he's personally doing and then his command responsibilities. Starting off, we're going to look at Charge 1, William T. Sherman, and this would read almost like the military does these things, and Mark or somebody who's been around these things can probably verify that the wording is similar. William T. Sherman, Major General, United States Army, is charged with violation of Article 23, General Order Number 100, which states, private citizens are no longer murdered, enslaved, and I highlight this part, are carried off to distant parts, and the inoffensive individual is as little disturbed in his private relations as the commander of hostile troops can afford to grant in the overruling demands of vigorous war. A couple key words there. Vigorous war means it's hard war. And remember, that's what Sherman said he was going to conduct, was hard war. Okay, so that's the charge. Now let's look at the specification number 1. And when you have this law up here, the person can violate this law several different times or ways, okay? And this is just simply the first one. And that Major General William T. Sherman did, on or about July the 5th, 1864, near Roswell, Georgia, approve and order the deportation of men, women, and children from the town of Roswell, Georgia, and did transport them outside the South to locations such as Indiana and other unknown places from which they were never to return. So let's look at the background of this crime, or this allegation of a crime, I should say. He's presumed innocent till we find him guilty. Roswell, anybody know where Roswell, Georgia is? Okay, I know you know, on Interstate 75 just north of Atlanta. Small town now, small town then. It was established actually in 1830 by a fellow named Roswell King. And if you're real big into Georgia history, Roswell King operated 5 plantations for a Yankee. His last name slips my mind, but was the largest slave owner in the state of Georgia. And the largest slave owner in the state of Georgia did not live in Georgia. He lived in Philadelphia. And he came down to Georgia every 3 years. Well, he had a contract with Roswell, Georgia to manage those 5 plantations of 1,500 slaves. In addition to which, Mr. Roswell owned 3 plantations of his own. I don't know how many slaves he had on his. And the Roswells come from Liberty County, Georgia, which is where my family originally came from. And Roswell and Major James S. Bullock, Stephen Bullock, father of Naval Commander James D. Bullock in the Civil War. They came over there in 1830. Actually, they were looking for land to buy. They discovered gold while they were there. Most of the gold, you think of the gold coming from Dahlgreen, Georgia, but the original gold rush in the United States was at Roswell, Georgia, and Dahlgreen in that area there. Unfortunately, there were a bunch of pesky Indians there, and it took Andrew Jackson to decide that he'd rather see the white people get the gold than to see the Indians keep the gold. So they were headed west on what is called the Trail of Tears.
What was the year of that gold rush?
Somewhere about 1830. They went over there in 1830 for their visit, so it was right after that. And anyway, they decided to move over there eventually and live. And this is a home of James D. Bullock, again, my ancestral resident, or ancestor anyway. And this picture was taken, I don't know, I think last May or something like that. And the home still stands. For those of you who don't know her, there's my dog checking out to see how the Bullock dogs are doing. And that's in the garden right next to the house. And a little hard to see it, but here is a memorial to James D. Bullock, who was the head of the Confederate Secret Service in Europe and a naval commander. Just a short distance from them was where the Roswells built their home. The Bullocks are the ancestors of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt visited this site back in the early 1900s, and because his mother was born in that plantation house, and his father was married in that plantation house, even though he was a New Yorker. Led to some touchy situations because they were abolitionists. Yes?
The majority of these plantations would be cotton growing big.
Probably were cotton here. The ones over in Liberty County would have been rice plantations. Roswell King is the moving spirit behind Roswell, Georgia. And he builds this as a mill town along the ones that you've seen pictures of Lowell, Massachusetts, the big mills up there, the company towns with all the boarding houses and the young girls who work there in the mills. And so this was constructed the same way. His intent was that it would provide employment for young single white women. By the time of the Civil War, most of them are not young single white women. There's a mixture of married and single women. But it's predominantly a female job there working in the mills. Were there slaves in Roswell? Certainly. The Bullocks had 19 slaves that run that house that we just saw, and not quite 20 to make him as a planter. You needed 20 to qualify for that. But they were not a part of the labor force there. It was intended to be a white, free labor. Relatively few males in the town. Those who didn't volunteer and join would have been conscripted. But there were males in the town, and they would have held exemptions from the Confederate government, primarily because they were the mechanics and the engineers that kept the mills operating, that provided the Confederates with uniforms. So they had a little bit of a stake in this. And by time of the Civil War, Roswell King has passed into history. His son, Barrington King, owns the mills. And when Barrington King hears that the Yankees are coming their way, he sells the mills. I say $1, but it could have been some other small nominal fee, to a French citizen named Theophilin Roche. Okay, that's who he sells it to. And the caveat is the mills have to be sold back to him after the war. So Sherman is aware of the existence of these mills in Roswell, Georgia, and some mills at New Manchester, Georgia. Notice the name New Manchester for the Manchester, Massachusetts mills. Sherman is aware of the existence of these mills because you may recall that when he started his Georgia campaign, he had contacted the Census Bureau in Washington and had them provide him county by county data of the number of mills, blacksmiths, every conceivable thing that he would need to know on this campaign. So he was fully informed of the existence of these mills and the ones at New Manchester. Okay, and here's a picture of the Roswell Mills. You can see one of these buildings is 1, 2, 3, at least 4 stories tall. In the 1830s, gold used to trickle down from these things. The gold would come out of the mountains up there, wash loose up in the mountains, and then eventually make its way down. And that's where they were mining the gold, same way you would out in California with that little pan. So let's look at our first SITREP number 1, situation report number 1. And this is going to be on the morning of July the 5th, 1864. And Sherman assumes that the mills have been abandoned by the workers. I mean, it doesn't cross his mind that the Confederates would still keep these mills operating with him only a few miles away. It just sort of doesn't make sense. And typically, the Southern administration, when they knew the Union was coming in a certain direction, they stripped the mills out. They loaded that stuff, put it on trains, and sent it elsewhere. They could not afford to lose the looms and stuff that made this mill operate. So Sherman assumes that there's no one there, that the workers have all fled and the equipment's been loaded up and shipped elsewhere. So he orders their destruction, and on the morning of July the 5th, Brigadier General Kenner Garrard, his 2nd Cavalry Division, arrives in Roswell. And when General Garrard, I guess that's the way he says it, rides into town, he's surprised. The mills are actually in full operation. There are 1,200 employees or more there running these mills, and the looms are working, and they're producing Confederate wool and Confederate cotton cloth. So he's a little taken back, but he's met by a Frenchman, and he points, General, you'll notice a French flag flying over these mills. This is a little French enclave here, and I expect your protection. You know, you don't want to get in trouble with France, and so please note that I'm a Frenchman, these are French mills now. So the general says, well, let me think about this. Gets off his horse and walks over to the mills and starts walking through them, and notices that all the cloth has CSA into the middle of it. And he says, I don't think so. I might be able to swallow this if you had an American flag flying up there beside the French flag, but no. So he destroys the mills, burns them all to the ground, and that sort of takes care of that. But he's got all these women and children and a few men there, and he's not quite sure what to do with them. So he sends to Sherman for instructions. What am I supposed to do with all these people? He knows what he's supposed to do with them because earlier Sherman had told him exactly how he wanted to deal with these situations. But just in case Sherman had changed his mind or waffled on it, he asked again. So Sherman's response is, I repeat my orders that you arrest all people, male and female, connected with those factories, no matter what the clamor, and let them foot it under guard to Marietta, which is about 15 miles away, whence I will send them by rail cars to the north. Useful laborers excused by reason of their skill as manufacturers from conscription are as much prisoners as if armed. The poor women will make a howl. Let them take along their children and clothing. And notice this, I highlight this, provided they have the means of hauling, or you can spare them. We will retain them until they can reach a country where they can live in peace and security. I mean, that sounds to me like he's not only just planning on sending them north, but maybe to Liberia or someplace. Not clear on that part. But, you know, suppose a woman doesn't have any way of taking her kids. Does he really seriously intend to have her march to Marietta and leave her kids sitting there on the ground? Anyway, that's the situation there. So if you got your sheets in front, if you would go ahead and mark whether you think he is guilty or innocent on the first one, remembering what the standard was. The standard was you're not supposed to deport people out of their area. So has he violated that standard or not? So we'll move on to specification number 2, which is another charge of the same crime, in that Major General William T. Sherman did, on or about July the 5th, 1864, near New Manchester, Georgia, approve and order the deportation of men, women, and children from the town of New Manchester, Georgia, and did transport them outside the South to locations such as Indiana and other unknown places from whence they were never to return. And not more than a half a dozen of these women ever returned to Roswell, Georgia. They were gone. So, what's situation report number 3? Major Haviland Tompkins, who's the provost marshal in the Army of the Ohio, rides in there, assembles all the mill hands. The mills, like the ones in Roswell, are in full operation. The men, the women, and all that run them are in there producing Confederate cloth. Assembles them outside, and he tells them that they have 2 choices. They can stay in the company-owned housing, and or plan B, you can go south. But to do either one of these 2 things, you have to give me your parole that you will no longer work and produce goods for the Confederate government. Now, each one of these mills employs about 450 employees. New Manchester has 3 mills, 450, that's 1,200 or so. That's a lot of people there. And Roswell had 5 mills, again at 450, you know, that's over 2,000 people there. But at least these guys get a choice. The people in Roswell had no choice. And he says, otherwise the Army intends to send them north of the Ohio River and turn them loose to shift for themselves. Well, that's real great. I mean, you're a Southerner, you're shipped up north, your train goes through a railroad station, and then just sort of shove you off there on your own. No support systems. You're in a hostile town that probably doesn't like Southerners in the first place. What do you do to survive? Because it doesn't sound like they plan to do anything. Shift for yourself. One of the things that we have in a lot of these allegations about crimes on Sherman's Georgia campaign is a lot of people will say, well, you know, these were prejudiced people, they're biased, they made these things up, they're hard to validate any of these things. Most of these I've quoted for you have come right out of the official records of the Civil War. Those are valid, solid pieces of evidence. There's no disputing the authenticity of those things. It's not something that's just made up. Most of these I've quoted for you have come right out of the official records of the Civil War. Those are valid, solid pieces of evidence. There's no disputing the authenticity of those things. It's not something that's just made up. Major Tompkins does something else too. For those who intend to stay there and live in these houses, or those who intend to go further south, he opens up the Mills commissary and allows them to take out all the food and stuff that's in the commissary, and then what they don't take, he burns down too. There are about 100 mill employees from New Manchester that actually end up getting put on wagons and taken to Marietta, Georgia. We don't have a figure for the number of the ones at Roswell, but that means probably about 700 people signed the paroles. Because again, if you say 450 times 3 mills, that's still over 1,200 people, so about 1,100 or so signed paroles. And here is a current, I have to say current photo because it's shot at a high angle, which makes me think it was probably shot from a helicopter, of one of the remaining mills at New Manchester. The one in Roswell, they still exist, but you would be taking your life in your hand to try and go and look at those mills. They're covered over with kudzu, brush, brambles, and they're said to be 10 rattlesnakes per square yard and coral snakes and water moccasins too. So it's not a place that you can go to get a sentimental brick to keep from this place. But this area looks awful. I don't know when, like I say, I have no idea when this photo was taken. Obviously much after the war, but it certainly looks like it's gone through some warfare of its own. So now we'll come back and ask you how would you feel on specification number 2? Was Sherman guilty of a war crime or not? Did he violate the thing which says you will not deport people from their country? And while you're doing that, we'll move on to charge number 2. In that William T. Sherman, Major General, United States Army, is charged with violation of Article 12, General Order number 100, which says, whenever feasible, martial law is carried out in the cases of individual offenders by military courts, but sentences of death shall be executed only with the approval of the Chief Executive, which is Lincoln, provided the urgency of the case does not require a speedier execution, and then only with the approval of the Chief Commander, which would have been Grant. So basically, Sherman has no authority on his own to execute someone. So let's look at the specification, the details of the crime that goes with that one, okay? In that on or about July the 5th, 1864, Major General William T. Sherman did authorize and direct Brigadier General Colonel Girard to hang one, Mr. Theophilin Roche, a French citizen, without trial by military commission, or awaiting approval of sentence for execution from the President of the United States as required by Article 12, General Order number 100. And Sherman was pretty incensed about this. He felt this was kind of a trick, and therefore this guy ought to be hanged for trying the trick. In a letter from, now again we go back to, a lot of these things are hard to prove, you know, like somebody came into my house and stole my hams or my chickens. Okay, this one we have good solid proof. Official Records, Series 1, Volume 38, Part 5, page 76, in which Sherman says, and we have it in Sherman's words, in a letter from General Sherman to General Girard dated July the 7th, 1864, Sherman orders, should you, under the impulse of anger, natural at contemplating such perfidy, hang the wretch, Theophilin Roche, I approve the act beforehand. Hello, you've approved his execution before you've even had his trial. and you violated the order by not waiting for the president to approve his execution. Yeah, that's a couple things right there. Okay, well, General Girard's a more sensible man than Sherman, and he decides not to try or to hang Mr. Roche, but rather he puts him in the wagon with all the women and children and sends them to Marietta to be shipped up north, deported up north. And that kind of ends that. But that doesn't excuse Sherman. He was quite willing to hang this poor man. On charge number 2, specification number 2, how do y'all vote? Is he guilty? Did he violate the Articles of War or not? You go ahead and mark your sheet. And like I said, Mark and the chaplain are going to tally these up when we're all done and see what y'all decide. See if we have enough evidence to indict the man. Okay, this one now is a little more dicey. Charge number 3 is Army Group Commander. And remember, an Army Group Commander was like Omar Bradley in World War II, commanded several armies. And he commanded 3 armies in this campaign. Major General, United States Army is charged with failing to discharge his duty as commander to control the operations of the members of his command between July the 1st, 1864 and December the 25th, 1864 in violation of Special Field Order number 120. Now, a couple things here. A little hard to see the quotation mark things there, but I've taken this exact wording out of somebody else's military commission that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. So this is the exact wording that was used to hang somebody else. December the 25th, I believe that's kind of the day that he pulled in to Savannah, Georgia. So, okay. So specification number 1 in that Major General William T. Sherman, in spite of having issued Special Field Order 120, prescribing the appropriate behavior for troops under his command, failed to implement procedures to ensure compliance with his order. Special Field Order number 120 was issued by Sherman, telling his troops how they were to behave on their march through Georgia. That Special Field Order says for each brigade, the commander will take 1 company out of that brigade, and they will be designated as foragers. No one else is to do foraging. No one else is to enter private homes. No one else is to take any personal property from anybody. That's what the order says. Only this 1 company, and they're only going to forage food that they need for feeding their own army. When it comes to the destruction of property, only 4 people are authorized to destroy Confederate private property, and that is the 4 Corps commanders who were on that march. So if you're going to burn somebody's house or somebody's building, you had to go to one of the 4 Corps commanders for approval to burn a house. And as we all know, that certainly did not happen. Just some photos here. This is the one of Atlanta burning. Was that a crime? Nope. I think most people would agree the burning of Atlanta was not a crime because it met military necessity. It was a vital transportation hub. It was a home to factories. Lots of reasons for burning Atlanta. And when he burned Atlanta, he violated no particular article of war in doing so. But here's one of some of his bummers. He's showing off all the watches he's gathered. You notice they're wearing top hats, and a little hard to see, but they're smoking a cigar. I don't think the Union Army issued top hats, so those top hats, inconsequential as they are, were stolen property. Certainly the watches were stolen property, and the Federal Army had no need to forage for watches from the countryside as they moved through it. That's plain looting and stealing, for which Sherman is responsible. Okay, here's another one, and a little hard to tell, but apparently in the back here there's a home burning. And again, they're foraging from people, looting from people, I'm sorry. Foraging is legitimate, looting is illegal. And remember, only a corps commander could approve the burning of a house. So there were a couple federal commanders who did say no and did try and enforce the provisions of Special Field Order number 120. The two were Major Generals Oliver O. Howard and Jefferson C. Davis. Does Jefferson C. Davis, that name ring a bell to anybody?
Yeah, famous Union general.
And? Okay. General Davis shot and killed his commanding officer, murdered his commanding officer. They'd had a disagreement. His commanding officer slapped him in the face. He pulled out his pistol and shot him dead and was placed under arrest. However, he was a moderately good division commander, and they needed him in the Union Army. So after staying in jail for a few days, he was released from prison and assumed his boss's position. That's one of the reasons in the military, back when they still had duels, you could never have a duel with your commanding officer because it was too easy to get promoted. Well, it worked here for Jefferson C. Davis. Okay, he assumed he was a brigade commander, and he assumed a division commander, and he finally ends up as a corps commander. The other place his name should stir your memory is on the march through Georgia. I don't remember what river they're crossing, but he's put down some pontoon bridges. And after they're all across of it, they take up the pontoon bridges, and there are hundreds and hundreds of contrabands coming behind, and about 350 contrabands felt they were being abandoned to the Wheeler's cavalry, so they jump in the river and try and swim it, and they drown. So and there was a pretty good-sized hullabaloo raised up north about that. Sherman defended him on that one too. General Howard convenes a court-martial and sentences a man to death for stealing a ham. The court-martial sentencing him to death. Howard kind of thought that was a little bit stiff for stealing a ham, and basically sentenced him to 20 years on the dry Tortugas. So still pretty stiff sentence there. General Davis, now, he was, as we already know, he is a very quixotic person, not what I would call mentally stable. He used a variety of techniques on people that looted, okay? As he was going down the road, he saw some Union soldiers coming out of a house with a bunch of dresses, fancy dresses. And again, you know, the Union Army had no need for such thing. It was obviously not intended for the commissary. Well, he requires that for the next week or so that they wear dresses. So they had to march behind the wagons wearing these dresses that they had liberated. In other cases, he did other forms of discipline, but he didn't have a systematic way of disciplining his troops. It was kind of how he felt at the moment. You know, if he felt like he was incensed at what you were doing, he punished you, and if he was tired and worn out, he ignored it. So, but these were the only two of the Union commanders that tried to do anything about looting. Photograph of General Oliver O. Howard. I don't know why, but in my mind, it sticks in my mind that he only had one arm.
That's correct.
Okay. This picture here, kind of hard to tell, because I don't know where he lost his arm, but looks like he has two arms there. And here is Major General Jefferson C. Davis. Now, one of the final crimes that they did along the way is, if I'd had that copy of General Order 100, it also forbids the abuse, destruction of houses of worship. Houses of worship, colleges and universities, and hospitals and museums were exempt. They were not to be destroyed or anything like that. This is where my family came over in 1756. The original church burned down. The British burned that down in the Revolution. And this is a church that was built in 1790. It still stands there today. In spite of all the hurricanes that come through that part of Georgia, it still exists. And Roswell King, this is the area where he operated those 5 plantations and where my family came from. Kind of leave it at that. Sure, lots of you've heard about General Judson Kilpatrick, probably the dumbest officer to ever wear the federal uniform. He was so dumb that he got injured when he was in the Army of the Potomac. And while he was home recovering, when he got well and came back, Grant didn't have a place for him. He didn't want him back in his command and just, sorry, I don't have anything for you. Well, coincidentally, Sherman had wrote Grant saying, I need a cavalry commander. And the two things happened right at the same time. So Grant says, okay, I'm going to pack you off to Sherman. But he writes Sherman telling him, this guy's an idiot. And Sherman says, that's just what I'm looking for. So, and he got what he asked for on this one.
He nicknamed,
Kill cavalry, yes. He was one of the brigadier generals in the Civil War, usually led from the front, not Kilpatrick. Kilpatrick, as a brigadier general, led from the rear and was always, when things got hot, the first man off the field. And always his men suffered severe casualties, hence the nickname Kill Cavalry. It was accompanied by, I hesitate to call them, 2 federal officers. They were second lieutenants. They were prostitutes. 2 female prostitutes wearing second lieutenant uniforms accompanied him on his campaign. And he was not adverse to cohabiting with various contrabands that struck his fancy too. So, and he was classmates to Wheeler. Both of them were in West Point together. They knew each other personally, and on one occasion, Wheeler's troops come into town, and he has to jump out a window and escape in his underwear. And of course, Wheeler ends up with his uniforms, his saber and everything. So he sends Kilpatrick a flag of truce, back our white flag of truce, and says, would you here are your uniforms back? Which had to be a little bit to swallow on. So, if you would go ahead now and vote on the third charge, specification number 1. And while you're doing that, General Sherman has asked me to read a statement on his behalf. Okay? We're going to take some literal, poetic license here, okay? And he says, no doubt, many acts of pillage, robbery, and violence were committed by these bummers. For I have since heard of jewelry taken from women and the plunder of articles that never reached the commissary. Remember, the foragers turned it into the commissary department. But these acts were exceptional and incidental. I've never heard of any cases of murder or rape. Well, 2 years later in a speech in Washington, D.C., Sherman concedes that he did hear of 2 cases of rape. He does not say that he did anything about them, charged anyone, convened a court-martial, or anything, but he does acknowledge there were at least 2 cases of rape brought to his attention. Obviously, Southerners claim there were many others along the Army's line of march. So much for Sherman's statement. Now, in response or rebuttal to what General Sherman has said, he's always kind of actually said it at various times. It was impossible to control his army of 70,000 people. That was just not a reasonable expectation. So here's a statement by Major Henry Hitchcock, who was Sherman's adjutant general. I'm bound to say I think Sherman lacking in enforcing discipline. I am sure that a headquarters provost marshal with a rigid system of roll calls in every company required at every halt severe punishment inflicted not only on men who straggle, but also on officers who fail to prevent it, would go far to prevent these outrages. In other words, as the troops are marching along, every time they halt for a rest, the first sergeant has to do a roll call to see who all is present. And that way you prevent these people wandering off and doing the various crimes.
Got to take your pencils up the first time I went to that.
Okay, so let's see. Okay, somebody's doing the tally. Now, while the tallying is going on, we're going to move forward here and talk about something called the Yamashita Standard. Has anybody ever heard of General Yamashita?
You can't do that.
Nobody? General Yamashita? Okay. General Yamashita was a Japanese general officer. He was the general who commanded the forces in Malaya that defeated the British so badly. And the British actually certainly deserved to be defeated badly the way they managed that campaign.
Is he the guy that beat the Brits at Singapore?
Yeah.
Okay, I've heard of him.
Yeah, I say Malaya, but Singapore is on the Malaya Peninsula. Yeah, he was.
Singapore.
Yeah. And after he had captured, after the British had surrendered at Singapore, Yamashita, some of his troops went over to the hospital there and killed and tortured a number of American prisoners of war that were in the hospital. When General Yamashita heard of this, he ordered his provost marshal to round up those people who did this, have them over at the hospital. He went over to the hospital, and he had those Japanese officers and enlisted people beheaded in front of the American soldiers. And then he went around and he personally apologized to each American prisoner that was in the hospital. So when you hear of all these awful things that he did, you sort of have to go back to that and say, really? That sounds out of character. General Yamashita after the war was tried for war crimes. I used the same wording in the charges that I used on Sherman, and was found guilty and was hanged. And it's one of the worst cases in judicial history that we have ever pulled off. It was just a really bad case. Now, no problem with the standard that came out of it. The standard that comes out of it is a commanding officer is responsible for the actions of his troops. No problem with that. It was just the way that they handled his case was just pretty bad. And that standard still exists today. Milosevic over in whatever country he was in, he was being tried and held accountable to the Yamashita standard. So that standard still applies today to all military people throughout the world. And it's usually managed by the International War Crimes people. And there's a photograph of General Yamashita. Already talked about that. So, let's see, do we have the totals?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Got the number circled. Oops.
Okay, the totals are circled.
Yes,
Great.
sir.
Okay. Well, here's what we found, okay, on charge 1, specification 1, about deporting the people from Roswell, Georgia, okay. 17 people found him guilty, 3 people found him not guilty. So he's guilty. Remember, too, in military courts, something like this, you don't have to have a majority. 3/4 is all you have to have for a conviction. Charge 1, specification number 2. This is deporting the people from New Manchester. That's going to be 15 people found him guilty, 4 people not guilty. Charge number 2, specification 1, which is about authorizing the pre-hanging of Mr. Roche. 16 people found him guilty, 4 people found him not guilty. And then on charge number 3, specification number 1, inadequately supervising his command or not exercising command responsibility. 15 people found him guilty. 5 people found him not guilty. So, based on this, we would probably say that he's guilty, right? Well, let's add another factor into this, okay? This, anybody know who, well, I guess I got his name on the bottom so you don't have to guess who he is. Meanest SOB that you ever encountered in the Air Force. I served for several years under him, and but I'd have to tell you, that man changed my life. I do certain things in my life because of the way he run his command. And anyway, this is a photograph of him in World War II. And he commanded the B-29s in World War II that bombed Japan. And as you can see, he killed approximately 337,000 Japanese, nearly all of them civilians. That number, you'll see it varies. You can see numbers all the way up to 900,000 people. They've come out with some new methods of trying to calculate the number of people killed, in which they have available to them the Japanese census records of how many people lived in each block. And they can go through now and with photographic analysis see how many blocks were burned, how many people lived in that block. And so these numbers tend to go up. These are the official numbers that have always existed. And he also commanded the B-29s that dropped the atomic bombs too. So, photograph of the firebombing of Tokyo. On one particular night, they burned 16 square miles of land. And people who would try and escape by jumping into the rivers, it did them no good because the rivers boiled them alive. So they, in fact, on one raid, this is the most famous of his raids, the March 9th and 10th raid, 97,000 people died. I question the 125,000 wounded. I would think that'd be a lot higher with that many people killed. Any number of other raids that had similar casualty levels. So, based on that, we've already read the verdict. This is what Lemay said after the war. I suppose if I had lost the war, what about all the other people that were there? What about you, Harris? Weren't you in World War II? Doesn't sound like General Lemay knew you were there. I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. That's his view of his own actions. So, the new rule that comes out of this, the new standard is, the winner writes the rules. In this case, there are no war criminals on the winning side, only on the losing side. And you can ask General Yamashita about that. So in spite of how you feel about it, we can't indict General Sherman as a war criminal because he was on the winning side that writes the rules. That's it.
Came along later, though.
You know, any professional historian would make mincemeat out of my presentation because one thing you don't do is you don't hold somebody in the past to modern day standards. So it's not fair to hold, regardless of how we feel about him, it's not fair for us to hold Sherman to the standard that was developed in World War II. He was dead.
But you find now that particularly since the 60s, a lot of people try to hold Lemay, who was 20th Air Force commander, authorized the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to modern memorials, modern laws. He's a war criminal.
The president gave the order to go drop the bombs.
Yes, the president had the ultimate, authority. But you also, there's about 10 years ago, someone wrote a book, a biography of Truman, that stated without evidence or supporting documentation or facts or whatever, that Truman was demented or didn't realize it, but he was emotionally destroyed the rest of his life for the evil thing that he'd done. Everything I've ever heard about Truman is he never regretted much of anything.